Chapter 22.
Night fell early, and I heard a distant hum. A song? Was it possible their eventide passed here with remembrances of the girl Morrigan, too? It didn't seem likely, and yet we had all sprung from the same beginnings. How far had those beginnings diverged? Night tugged at me, a quiet pull I wanted to give in to, yet the golden-lit windows of the officers' dining room lay ahead. I followed Madame Rathbone up the steps of a large wooden structure with a wide veranda all the way around it. "Wait," I said, grabbing her arm. "I need a moment." A furrow lined her brow.
"There's nothing to be afraid of."
"I know," I said, slightly breathless. "I'll be right in, please." She left, and I turned, bracing myself against the railing. I had always faced others' expectations, usually with little patience, snapping at the cabinet who pressured me in one way or another. But now I had to deal with another kind of expectation that I didn't fully understand. It was mired in complications, and I wasn't sure how to navigate them. Your future queen. When I walked through the door of the dining room, that was what they would see. I had told Caden that I would somehow make it all work, but I knew I couldn't. It was impossible. Someone always came out on the losing end. I didn't want it to be me and Rafe. I looked to the western sky and its constellations, Astor's diamonds, God's goblet, and Dragon's tail, the stars that hovered over Morrigan. I kissed my fingers and lifted them to the heavens, to home, to those I had left behind, to everyone I loved, including the dead. "Enada meunder ijutante," I whispered, then turned and pushed open the door of the dining room. Rafe was the first person I saw, and I secretly thanked the gods, because it made my heart weightless, soaring somewhere high and free. He stood when he saw me, and the look in his eyes made me grateful for Madame Rathbone's, Adeline's, and Vila's efforts. They had chosen well. His gaze made my heart settle back down, now warm and full in my chest. I looked past officers, wives, and whoever else was there, to where he stood at the end of the long dining room table, mesmerized. It was the first time I had ever seen Rafe dressed in his own kingdom's clothing. It was strangely unnerving, a confirmation of who he really was. He wore a deep blue officer's tunic over a loose black shirt, and a dark leather baldric embossed with Dalbrecht's crest crossed his chest. His hair had been trimmed, and his face gleamed with a close shave. I sensed heads turning, but I kept my eyes locked on Rafe, and my feet glided over the floor to his side. This was it. I had no understanding of Dalbrecht's formal customs. The royal scholar had tried to school me in the most basic of greetings, but I had skipped his lessons. Rafe held his hand out to me, and when I took it, I was shocked that he pulled me close and kissed me in front of everyone. A long, scandalous kiss. I felt color rush to my cheeks. If this was a custom, I liked it. When I turned to face the rest of the guests, it was quite apparent this sort of greeting was not standard protocol. Some of the ladies had color on their cheeks, too, and Sven's hand rested over his mouth as if he was trying to conceal a frown. "My compliments and gratitude, Madame Rathbone," Rafe said, "for taking such good care of the princess." He unclasped the fur cape around my shoulders and handed it to a servant. I sat in a chair next to him, and that was when I took in exactly who was present. Sven, Tavish, and Oren were all dressed in the deep Dalbrecht blues as well, their appearances transformed with a razor, soap, and crisply pressed clothes, officers in the powerful army that Sven had told me the history of so proudly. Sven, like Colonel Bodine, who sat at the opposite end, wore a gold braid on his shoulder too. There was nothing to distinguish Rafe in his position, but they certainly didn't keep the trimmings of a king on hand at an outpost. Colonel Bodine jumped in with introductions. Greetings were cordial but reserved, and then servants brought in the first of many courses served on small white porcelain plates. Warm goat cheese balls rolled in herbs, finger-sized rolls of chopped meat wrapped in thin strips of smoked pork, fried flatbreads shaped into bite-sized bowls and filled with warm spiced beans. Each course was served on a fresh plate, and we hadn't even gotten to the main course yet. "You'll see." Yes, I saw, though I was sure Colonel Bodine was setting a more extravagant table tonight, to honor not only their returned comrades, but the king they had thought was lost. Jeb's absence was due to the physician's orders for rest. No one else seemed to notice that Grizz and Caden weren't present, though I was certain they would both have been extremely uncomfortable at the table. At times I felt I was in a dreamlike fog. Only this morning we had been on the backs of horses fighting for our lives, and now I was navigating a sea of porcelain, silver, glowing candelabras, and 1,000 twinkling glasses. Everything seemed brighter and louder than it was. It was a celebratory evening, and I noted the effort to keep conversation light. Colonel Bodine brought out his revered red-eye and poured Sven a glass. He announced that another celebration was in the works that would include the entire outpost. It would give all the soldiers a chance to toast their new king and, Colonel Bodine added hesitantly, their future queen. "Marabella parties are unmatched," Viola said with excitement.
"It lifts spirits," Bodine added.
"And there's dancing,"
Madame Rathbone said. I assured them all I was eager to partake. Between courses, toasts were offered, and as the wine and spirits flowed, caution was forgotten, and more conversation was directed at me. "Madame Rathbone told me you set a fine table," I said to Colonel Bodine, "and I must admit I am quite impressed." "The Marabella outpost is known for its exceptional food," Fiona, Lieutenant Belmonte's wife, answered, her voice filled with pride.
"The better fed a soldier, the better they can serve,"
Colonel Bodine explained, as if the food wasn't an extravagance, but a battle strategy. The memory of the Commissar's assured grin and tall, shining silos shimmered behind my eyes. Great armies march on their stomachs. I stared down at the plate before me. A smear of orange sauce and a pheasant leg bone lay upon it. There had been no plates of bones to pass before the meal, no acknowledgement of sacrifice. Its absence left a strange hole in me that begged to be filled. I wasn't sure what had happened to my own tether of bones. It had probably been thrown away along with my bloody and torn clothes as something unclean and savage. I discreetly slipped the bone from the plate and hid it in my napkin before the servant could take it away.
"I can't imagine what you suffered at the hands of those savages,"
Madame Haig said. "If you mean the Vendans, yes, some were savage, but many others were extremely kind." She raised her eyebrows as if doubtful. Captain Haig threw back another glass of wine.
"But you must regret your decision to flee the wedding. All this—"
"No, Captain. I don't regret my decision." The table grew silent. "If I had been shipped off to Dalbreck, there are valuable things I never would have learned." Lieutenant Dupre leaned forward. "Surely there are easier ways to learn lessons of youth." "Not lessons, Lieutenant. Cold, hard facts. The Vendans have amassed an army and devised weapons that could wipe out both Dalbreck and Morrigan." Dubious glances were exchanged. A few eyes came close to outright rolling. Poor, delirious girl. Rafe put his hand on mine.
"Leah, we can talk about this later. Tomorrow, with the colonel and other officers."
He quickly suggested we retire and excused us. As we walked past Sven and Bodine, I eyed the near-empty bottle of red-eye. I grabbed it from the table and sniffed. "Colonel Bodine, do you mind if I take the rest of this with me?" His eyes widened.
"I'm afraid it's very strong brew, Your Highness."
"Yes, I know." He looked at Rafe for approval, and Rafe nodded. I was getting quite weary of everyone deferring to Rafe before answering me. "It's not for me," I explained, then shot an accusing stare at Sven. "We did promise Grizz a glass, didn't we?" Bodine remained gracious, but several of the dinner guests cleared their throats and stared at Bodine, waiting for a refusal to share the red-eye. I understood their disapproval. They had just learned of an entire platoon's demise at the hands of Vendans. Still, everyone couldn't keep ignoring the fact that Caden and Grizz had suffered injuries to help save our lives. Rafe took the bottle from me and handed it to a sentry standing at the door. "See that the large fellow in the surgeon's barracks gets this." Rafe looked back at me and raised his brows as if to ask if the problem was solved, and I nodded my satisfaction. "These are your quarters," Rafe said, pulling aside the curtained entry of the tent. Even in the dim glowing light of an overhead chandelier, I was met with a shock of color. A lush indigo carpet swirling with flowers covered the entirety of the floor. A blue velvet quilt, white satin pillows, and fur blankets were piled high on a canopied bed, topped with finials carved in the shapes of lion heads. Elegant blue drapes were gathered back with gold cording, waiting to be pulled, and a squat stove with an intricate grill was nearby. Fresh cornflowers graced a side table, and a small dining table with 2 chairs was in a corner. It was more luxurious than my own chamber at home. "And your quarters?" I asked.
Over there."
A dozen yards away, a similar tent had been erected. A short distance that seemed so far. We hadn't slept apart since we left the sanctum. I had grown accustomed to feeling his arm around my waist, the warmth of his breath on my neck, and I couldn't imagine him not being with me tonight, especially now that we finally had what might be called real privacy. I smoothed back a lock from his face. His lids were heavy. "You've gotten no rest, have you?"
"Not yet. There will be time for that later."
"Rafe," I said, stopping him. "Some things can't be put off until later. We still haven't talked about your parents. Are you all right?" He let the tent curtain drop, blocking out the lantern light, and we were in darkness again.
"I'm fine,"
he said. I cradled his face and drew him closer, our foreheads touching, our breaths mingling, and it seemed tears swelled in both our throats. "I'm sorry, Rafe," I whispered. His jaw tensed beneath my touch.
"I was where I needed to be. With you. My parents would understand."
Each word he spoke throbbed in the space between us.
"My being with them wouldn't have changed anything."
"But you could have said goodbye." His arms circled around me, holding me tight, and it felt like all the grief he would ever be allowed was in that grip. I could think only of the cruelty of his new position and what was immediately expected of him. His hold finally loosened, and he looked at me, tired creases at the corners of his eyes, a smile through his exhaustion. "Stay with me?" I asked. His lips met mine, and he whispered against them between kisses.
"Are you trying to seduce me, Your Highness?"
"Absolutely," I said, and leisurely ran the tip of my tongue along his lower lip like it was my final course of the evening. He pulled away slightly and sighed.
"We're in the middle of an outpost with 100 eyes watching, probably right now from the dining room windows."
"You didn't seem to be worried about what others thought when you kissed me in there."
"I was overcome with the moment. Besides, kissing you and staying the night in your tent are 2 different things."
"You're afraid you'll taint my reputation?" An evil grin pulled at the corner of his mouth.
"I'm afraid you'll taint mine."
I punched him playfully in the ribs, but then felt the smile fade from my face. I understood protocol, especially with royals. By the gods, I had lived with it my entire life. I also knew Rafe was in an especially delicate position now, all eyes newly trained on him. But we had both nearly died. I was tired of waiting. "I want to be with you, Rafe. Now. It seems waiting is all we've ever done. I don't care what anyone thinks. What if there are no tomorrows? What if now is all we'll ever have?" He reached up and gently pressed his finger to my lips.
"Shh. Don't ever say that. We have a lifetime ahead of us. 100 tomorrows and more. I promise. That's what all this has been about. Every breath, every step I've taken has been for our future together. There's nothing I want more than to disappear into this tent with you. But I do care what they think. They've only just met you, and I've already disregarded every protocol expected of a prince."
I sighed. "And now you're king."
"But I can at least come in and light the stove for you. That won't take me long."
I told him I could light it myself, but he pulled aside the curtain and led me in, and I didn't protest further. He checked the flue in the tall round chimney that vented through the top of the tent, and then lit the kindling. He sat back on the side of the bed, watching to make sure the wood caught. I walked around the tent, brushing my fingers along the bed drapes, taking in the extravagance. "This really wasn't all necessary, Rafe," I said over my shoulder. I heard him poking at the wood.
"Where else would you stay? In the soldiers' barracks?"
"Anything would be a luxury compared to where I have been sleeping." I spotted my belongings on the table. They were carefully placed in a neat pile, but the saddlebag was gone. I pulled my hairbrush from the stack and began pulling pins from my hair, undoing all of Adeline's beautiful work. Or I could have slept in Madame Rathbone's sitting room, though her husband might not have. I heard an odd thump and turned. The poker had slipped from Rafe's grasp and now lay on the floor. It appeared I was going to get my wish after all. Rafe? He was out cold. He lay on my bed, his feet still on the floor, and his hands limp at his sides. I walked over and whispered his name again, but he didn't respond. Even a stubborn king could stay awake only so long. I pulled his boots off, and he barely stirred. Next came his belts. I couldn't wrestle with his dead weight, so the clothes would have to stay. I lifted up his legs and turned them so he was fully on the bed. He mumbled a few incoherent words about leaving, and then didn't utter another sound. I removed my pauldron and jewelry and struggled to unlace the leather corset on my own. Once I extinguished the chandelier lights, I curled up on the bed beside him and pulled the furs over both of us. His face was serene, glowing in the firelight. "Rest, sweet farmer," I whispered. I kissed his cheek, his chin, his lips, memorizing every inch of his skin beneath my touch. 100 tomorrows. I laid my head on the pillow next to his and slid my hand around his waist, holding him, still afraid he might slip away, and our tomorrows would never come.
Chapter 23.
I sensed him slipping from beneath my arm in the middle of the night, but I thought he had just rolled over. When I woke early the next morning, he was gone. All I found was a servant with wary eyes and a tray of tarts, dried fruit, and cream. She set it on the table and curtsied. "I'm Tilda. His Majesty told me to tell you he had meetings and would check on you later. In the meantime, I am to help with anything you require." I looked down at the rumpled gown I had slept in. "Madame Rathbone is sending more clothes over soon," Tilda said. "She also wanted to know if you wanted your other belongings cleaned or burned." I knew they assumed everything should be burned. The clothing was beyond repair, but my boots, and especially Walther's baldric, were not things I could let go. And then when I thought of it, the remains of the dress of many hands was not something I could let go of either. I told her I would clean the items myself if she would bring them to me. "I'll take care of it right away, ma'am." She curtsied and scurried out of the tent. I brushed my hair, pulled on the dainty slippers Viola had lent me, and left to find Colonel Bodine's office. The thick walls of the outpost were bright in the morning sun. Everything about the garrison was pristine and intimidating in its order. It exuded the confidence of a kingdom that was strong all the way down to its foundation. Even the ground between the buildings was covered with neatly raked gravel the color of marmalade. It crunched lightly beneath my feet as I approached a long building that looked similar to the dining hall, but that had only small, high windows. Perhaps they wanted no one to see who met within. The officers looked up in surprise when I opened the door, but neither Rafe, Sven, nor Colonel Bodine was present. "Your Highness," Lieutenant Belmonte said as he rose to his feet, "is there something we can do for you?" "I was told we would meet today. I came to continue our discussion of last night, about the Vendon army. You need to be aware." Captain Haig dropped a thick stack of papers onto the table with a loud thud. "The king has already informed us of developments in Venda," he said, and then added pointedly while surveying my rumpled dress, "while you were still sleeping." I smoothed out my dress. "I respect what the king may have already told you, but he didn't see what I saw when—"
"Are you a trained soldier, your highness?"
He cut me off so sharply he may as well have slapped me. The sting hissed through the air. So this was how it was to be. I leaned forward, my palms flat on the table, and met his stare. "Yes, I am, Captain, though perhaps trained with a different eye than yours."
"Oh, of course,"
he said, sitting back in his chair, his tone ripe with disdain.
"That's right. The Moragese army does do things a little differently. It must have something to do with that gift of yours."
He shot a grin at an officer next to him.
"Go ahead, then. Why don't you tell us just what you think you saw?"
The ass. Apparently Rafe's claim of me as his future queen carried little weight with the captain, as long as the king wasn't present. but I couldn't let my pride nor contempt keep me from sharing what they needed to know. So I told them everything I knew about the army city.
100,000 armed soldiers is a staggering claim, he said when I finished, especially for a people as backward as the barbarians.
They are not so backward, I countered. And the men I rode in with, Caden and Grizz, can confirm what I've told you. Captain Haig rose from his chair, his face splotched with sudden color.
May I remind you, Your Highness, we have just lost 28 men to the barbarians. The only way we'll be gathering information from savages like them will be at the end of a knotted whip.
I leaned forward. And it is clear you would prefer to gain it from me in the same way. Captain Azia laid a hand on Haig's arm and whispered something to him. Haig sat down. Please understand, Your Highness, Azia said. The loss of the platoon has been a bitter blow to all of us, especially to Captain Haig. One of his cousins was a soldier in the unit. My hands slid from the table, and I stood straight, taking a calming breath. I understood grief. My condolences, Captain. I'm sorry for your loss. But please make no mistake. I owe a debt to the men you slander, and if they are not invited to our table, do not expect to see me there either. His wiry brows fell low over his eyes.
I will convey your wishes to Colonel Bodine.
I was just turning to leave when a door at the back of the room opened, and Colonel Bodine, along with Sven, Rafe, and Tavish, emerged. They startled when they saw me, and Rafe's eyes turned briefly sharp, as if I had undermined him. I was just leaving, I said. It seems you've already taken care of matters here. I was out the door and halfway down the stairs before Rafe stepped out on the veranda and stopped me. Leah, what's wrong? I thought we were going to meet with the officers together. He shook his head, his expression apologetic. You were asleep. I didn't want to wake you. But I told them everything you told me. About the silos? Yes. The Brezelots? Yes. The size of the army? Yes, I told them everything. Everything? There were some things even I might have held back. The traitors on the Morrigee's court? He nodded. I had to, Leah. Of course he did. But I could only imagine how it lowered their regard for Morrigan and me even further. I came from a court roiling with snakes. I sighed. They didn't seem to believe anything I said about the Vendon army. He reached out and took my hand. If they seem skeptical, it's because they've never encountered barbarian patrols that numbered more than a dozen before. But I told them what I saw too, the armed and organized brigade of at least 500 that led you into Venda. Trust me, we're evaluating the measures that need to be taken, especially now with the deaths of an entire... I let out a soft groan. I'm afraid I've gotten off to a bad start with your officers, and Captain Haig already dislikes me intensely. I didn't realize one of the dead was his cousin. He and I had a bit of a clash in there. Bad news or not, Captain Haig is always a pill best taken with strong ale. At least that's what Sven tells me. I know the man only in passing. Sven's right. He made it clear he had no respect for the Morrigee's army, and he scorned the gift as well. I was as welcome in there as a skinned knee. Why in the gods' names did Dalbreck ever want me if they had no regard for first daughters and the gift? Rafe seemed momentarily stunned, his shoulders pulling back as if my question unsettled him. He quickly recovered. The captain insulted you. I'll speak to him. No, I said, shaking my head. Please don't. The last thing I want is to look like an injured child who ran tattling to the king. We'll work it out. He nodded and brought my hand to his lips and kissed it. I'll try to wrap up these meetings as soon as I can. Is there anything I can help with? A weary grimace lined his eyes, and he told me that a lot more had transpired in his absence besides his parents' deaths. With no strong leadership, the Assembly and Cabinet had been warring. Certain egos had flared, generals were questioning the chain of command, and fear over the scourge that had killed the Queen had affected commerce, all while they were keeping the king's death a secret from the rest of the world. There were battles waiting for Rafe on every front once he got back to the palace. When will that be, Rafe? I hated to push the point, especially now, but I had no choice. You know that Morrigan still needs to be warned, that I need to... I know, Leah. Please, just give me a few days to deal with all this first. Then we can talk about... Sven poked his head out the door. Your Majesty, he said, rolling his eyes toward the room behind him.
"They grow restless."
Rafe glanced back in my direction, lingering like he never wanted to leave. I saw the shadows that still lurked under his eyes. He'd only had a few hours of sleep when he needed a week, and had been granted only a passing moment of mourning when he needed far more. All he asked from me was a few days to juggle his new role as king, but a few days seemed like a luxury Morrigan couldn't afford. I nodded, and he turned and disappeared behind the door with Sven before I could even say goodbye. I hooked the last buckle of the bodice and adjusted the belt. I was grateful that Viola and Adeline had brought me more practical clothes, a split leather skirt, jerkin, and shirt, but they were no less luxurious than the gown I had worn last night. The embossed brown leather was so supple it felt like it might melt between my fingers. The old broken and knotted laces had been replaced on my newly cleaned boots, and Walther's baldric was snug against my chest, gleaming like the day Greta had given it to him. "A family heirloom?" Viola asked. They both looked at me tentatively, as if they'd read something painful in my expression when I put it on. They were as kind as Captain Haig was nasty. I smiled and nodded, trying to erase any sadness they had seen. "I'm ready." They offered to give me a tour of the outpost, which was contained within a large oval wall. Rafe's and my tents were just outside the officers' housing and the dining room. They pointed out the rows of soldiers' barracks as we walked, the soldiers' dining hall, the surgeon's bungalow, and tucked between them all, the cookhouse. We came to a wide gate that led to the lower level of the outpost. After pointing out the barns, paddocks, and the cook's garden, they showed me the mews where the Valspree were caged. They were striking birds with white plumage, sharp claws, and an intimidating stare. Their glowing red eyes had a black slash of feathers above them. Viola said they were swift flyers with wingspans of 5 feet. "They're able to fly thousands of miles without stopping. It's how we send messages between outposts and the capital." When I asked if they could be sent anywhere, she said they were only trained to fly to certain destinations. Their heads turned eerily, watching us as we passed. Below the rear wall was the river that wound behind the outpost. We circled back to the upper level, and they showed me the laundry house, which was enormous. That didn't surprise me, given their love affair with clothes. Finally, we found ourselves at the front of the outpost again, near Colonel Bodine's offices. I looked at the small, high windows and wondered what measures they had discussed. "Can we go out there?" I asked, pointing to the watchtower gate. Rafe had said that vagabonds often camped near the outpost walls. I hadn't seen Bihara's band of wagons when we had approached yesterday, but in truth I'd seen very little besides the people flooding out to meet us. Now I wondered if she and the rest could be out there somewhere in the makeshift city. "Of course," Adeline said cheerfully. A small door in the massive watchtower gate was open, and as Rafe had ordered, soldiers 4 deep guarded it. Each one held a well-polished halberd. They let other soldiers pass through freely, but merchants were allowed only to leave messages, and then were turned away. As we approached, their halberds crossed and clicked like a well-timed machine to block us. "James," Adeline admonished, "what are you doing? Step aside. We're going out to—"
"You and Vi may pass," he replied, "but not Her Highness without an escort. King's orders."
I frowned. Rafe feared more Rattan could be out there. "These ladies don't count as my escorts?" I asked.
"Armed escorts," he clarified.
I made an exaggerated point of looking at the daggers at each of our sides. We were armed. James shook his head. Apparently our own weapons weren't enough. It was awkward walking among the merchant wagons with 6 sober-faced guards wielding sharp, pointy halberds, but we were lucky that James had rustled up even these, because none of the 4 at the gate would leave their posts. The small wagon city reminded me in some ways of the Gehendra. A little something for everyone and every taste. Grilled foods, fabrics, leather goods, tents for games of chance, exotic brews, even a letter-writing service for soldiers who wanted to send home missives written with an elegant flair. Other merchants were there only to sell staples to the outpost and be on their way. I was still pondering that the outpost seemed to break the treaty calling for no permanent dwellings in the Canlanteau. Why had Eben's family been burned out when here in the same wilderness was a structure that housed hundreds? When I asked Adeline about this, one of the guards overheard me and answered in her stead.
"There are no permanent residents here. We are regularly rotated in and out."
His explanation sounded like a loophole exploited by the well-armed and powerful. I remembered Regan talking about the encampments where their patrols would rest, but I had always pictured them as temporary places of muddy ruts, shaky tents, and wind-blown soldiers huddling against the elements. Now I wondered if Morrigan had loopholes too, and their encampments were more permanent than I had believed them to be. I asked the whereabouts of the vagabond camps among the merchants as we walked, and I was always directed a short walk away, but none were the vagabonds I searched for. "The one Dihara leads?" I finally said to an old man who was pounding designs into a leather brow band. He paused from his work and used his chisel to point still farther down the wall.
"She's here, at the end."
My heart leapt, but only momentarily. His wrinkles deepened into unmistakable grimness. I ran in the direction he indicated, Viola, Adeline, and the soldiers struggling to keep up with me. When we found the camp, I understood the old man's grim expression. The camp was tucked under expansive pine boughs, but there were no chimes hanging from them. No painted ribbons or pounded copper twirled from branches. There was no steaming kettle in the midst of it all. There were no tents, only 3 scorched Carvaccis. Rena's Carvacci was more black now than purple. She sat on a log near the fire ring with one of the young mothers. Nearby, Tevio scraped the dirt with a sharp stick. Behind the Carvaccis, I spotted one of the men tending the horses with a child on his hip. There was no gaiety. I turned to the guards and pleaded with them to stay back. "Please," I said, "something is wrong." They surveyed the surroundings and reluctantly agreed to maintain their distance. Adeline and Viola planted themselves in front of them as their own kind of safeguard, a line not to be crossed. I approached, my chest hammering. "Rena?" Her face brightened, and she jumped up to meet me, squeezing me against her full breast as if she'd never let me go. When she loosened her grip and looked at me again, her eyes glistened. "Shemi Monselia! Uvifa!" "Yes, I live. But what has happened here?" I stared at her charred wagon. By now several others had joined us, including Tevio, who was pulling at my skirt. Rena drew me over to the fire to sit on the log and told me. Riders came. Vendans. Ones she had never seen before. Dihara went out to meet them, but they didn't want to talk. They held up a small knife. They said helping enemies of Venda could not go unavenged. They killed half the horses, torched the tents and wagons, and left. She and the others grabbed blankets and whatever they could to beat out the flames, but the tents were gone almost instantly. They managed to save 3 of the Carvaccis. From the moment she mentioned the small knife, a sick, salty taste swelled on my tongue. Natia's knife. When Rena finished, I stood, unable to contain my anger. One death was not good enough for the Commissar. I wanted to kill him again. I pounded my fist against the wooden side of the Carvacci, rage clawing through me. "Ida Monse, noi. You mustn't hurt yourself over this," Rena said, pulling me away from the Carvacci. She looked at the slivers in my hand and wrapped it in her scarf. "We will recover from this. Dihara said it was a season that none of us could prevent." "Dihara? Where is she? Is she all right?" The same grim lines spread out from Rena's eyes as I had seen on the old man. My knees weakened. "No," I said, shaking my head. "She lives," Rena said quickly to correct my assumption, but then added, "but maybe not for long. She is very old, and in stamping out the flames, her heart failed. Its beat, even now, is weak. The outpost healer came out to see her. May the gods bless him. But there was nothing he could do." "Where is she?" The inside of the Carvacci was dim, except for a thin blue flame flickering in a bowl of sweetly scented tallow, to keep the scent of death away. I carried a bucket of warm water floating with pungent leaves inside with me. She was propped up on pillows in the bed at the back of the wagon, feather light, gray ash to be blown away. I sensed death hovering in the corners, looking on, waiting. Her long silver braid was the only strength I saw, a rope that kept her moored to the living. I pulled a stool close and set the bucket down. She opened her eyes. "You heard her. Get the girl some goat cheese." The first words I'd ever heard her speak swelled in my chest.
You heard her.
She was one of the few who ever did. I dipped a rag into the bucket and squeezed it out. I wiped her forehead. You're not well. Her pale eyes searched my face.
It is a long way you've traveled, and you have farther yet to go.
Her breath faltered, and she blinked slowly.
Very far.
I've only traveled far by the strength you've given me.
No,
she whispered.
It was always in you, buried deep.
Her eyelids closed as if their weight was too much to bear. I rinsed the rag and wiped her neck, the elegant folds marking the days she had spent on this earth, the beautiful lines crowding her face like a finely drawn map, ancient, but now, in this moment, not nearly old enough. This world still needed more of her. She couldn't go. Her hand inched on top of mine, cold and papery light.
The child, Nadia. Speak to her,
she said, her eyes still closed.
Do not let her carry the guilt of me. What she did was right. The truth circled and gathered her into its arms.
I lifted her thin, wraith-like hands to my lips, squeezing my eyes shut. I nodded, swallowing the ache in my throat.
Enough,
she said, pulling her hand away.
I was almost eaten by wolves. Did I tell you? Erisol heard me crying in the woods. When the skies quaked with thunder, she taught me to shut out.
Her eyes opened, her pupils large black moons floating in a circle of gray, and she weakly shook her head.
No, that is my story, not yours. Yours is calling. Be on your way.
Why me, Dihara?
You already have the answer to that question. It had to be someone. Why not you?
These were the same words Venda had spoken to me. Cold fingers danced up my spine. This world, it breathes you in. It knows you, and then it breathes you out again, shares you. Her eyes drifted shut, and her tongue reverted back to her native one, her voice as faint as the flickering of the candle.
J's in there. J. Trevitoria.
Be brave. Be victorious. I stood to leave. It felt like it was impossible to be either.
Chapter 24. Rafe.
Sven tapped the table near my plate. Colonel Bodine will be offended. You're not eating. And these are the best bison chops I've ever had, Oren added as he sucked the last bit of sauce from a bone. Don't tell him I said so. I claimed mine were better. Tavish leaned back, his boots propped up on the table, scuffing the polished wood. He stared at me, not saying anything. We had taken a break from our discussions and were holed up in Bodine's office, while the other officers ate their midday meal in the meeting chamber. Sven stood and looked out the window. Don't worry, boy. All this will fall into place. It's a lot to take in at once. Boy, Tavish said, he's the bloomin' king now. He can strip it from my hide. I pushed my plate away. It's not just court matters on my mind. It's Leah. She had a run-in with Haig. Sven grunted. So? Everyone has run-ins with Haig. Nothing to worry about. What about the other officers? I asked. Have any of you gotten a sense how they feel about her? They don't hold her kingdom against her, Tavish said flatly. Belmonte, Armistead, and Azia were like captivated pups when they met her. Sven squinted, continuing to look at something out the window. That's all you're worried about? If they like her? No, that wasn't even half of it. Out on the veranda, I had seen her eyes. They spoke as much as her words before I cut her off. I had avoided the subject on our way here by stressing that our only goal was to reach the safety of the outpost. But now we were here. Her questions were harder to avoid. I leaned forward, rubbing my temples. No, that's not all I'm worried about. She wants to go home. Sven spun back to look at me. To Morrigan? Why would she want to do a fool thing like that? She thinks she needs to warn them about the Vendon army. The Komazar may have conveyed his big plans to her, but that doesn't mean they were a reality, Sven said. When was anything he said not tainted by his own ambitions? He reminded me that even some of the governors thought he had inflated his numbers. Orin licked his fingers. And a few thousand soldiers can look like a hell of a lot more when you're frightened. But we've known for some time that their numbers were growing, I said. It's what helped push us toward a marriage alliance with Morrigan. Sven rolled his eyes. There were many motivations for that. And numbers aren't the same as an army with centuries of training and experience like we have, Tavish countered. Not to mention, they no longer have a viable leader. Jeb frowned. But there was that small flask of liquid Leah gave to Rafe to blow up the bridge. That's a weapon none of the kingdoms have. And it took out the main gear, which had to be 12 feet of solid iron, I said. It's a worry. Sven sat back down. There are not bridges on a battlefield, and Brezelots can be taken down, assuming they even march. The council members will eat one another alive long before they ever get that bridge fixed. Orin reached for another chop. You're king. You just tell her she can't go. Tavish snorted. Tell her? You don't just tell a girl like her that she can't do something, he said, then turned a long, dissecting stare at me. He shook his head. Oh, holy hell. You already told her you'd take her there, didn't you? I blew out a puff of air and looked up at the ceiling. I may have. I pushed back my chair and stood, pacing the room. Yes, I did. But it was a long time ago, back at the Sanctum. I told her what she needed to hear at the moment, that we'd go back to Terravan. One day. I didn't say when. I was just trying to give her hope. Sven shrugged. So you told her what was expedient at the time. Tavish sucked in a slow breath. A lie. That's how she'll see it. It wasn't a lie. I thought that maybe someday I'd be able to take her back there. A long time from now if things change. But for the gods' sakes, there's a bounty on her head now, and the Morrigese cabinet is thick with traitors. I'd be insane to let her go back. She's probably facing a noose there now, Orin agreed. He rubbed his neck. Isn't that how they execute their criminals? Tavish shot him a glare. You're not helping. The girl loves you, boy, Sven said. Any fool can see she wants to be with you. Just tell her what you told us. She's a girl of reason. Sven's words cut the deepest. I turned away, pretending I was looking at a relic hanging on the wall. I saw her struggle every day. Some part of Venda still had its claws in her, and some part of Morrigan did too. Reason with her? It is hard to find reason when you're being torn in two. Part of her heart was in both kingdoms, and none of it was in Dalbrick. I heard her speaking to the clans on our last day there, Tavish said. That's part of the problem too, isn't it? I nodded. The one who was hunted, Orin mused. Their moods darkened. I realized they'd all heard it, and it disturbed them as much as it did me. Sven shook his head. That claw and vine on her shoulder is the damnedest thing. The Vendon clan seem to have a lot of regard for it. It's all that's left of our wedding kava. When we first met, she said the kava was a terrible mistake. Somehow, I had to make her believe that again.
Be true, my sisters and brothers. Not like the Shementra, the alluring creature with two seductive mouths. Its words flow luxurious, like a satin ribbon, binding up the unwary in its silken braids. But without ears to hear its own words, the Shementra is soon strangled, caught in the trail of its beautiful lies. Song of Venda.